Well, if you're just joining us in this series, we have been tackling a lot of topics that are considered taboo in our culture and even taboo in the church. And the reason why we've been tackling the taboo topics is because we've learned from experience that once we stop having conversations about topics because they're too sensitive or people get upset or afraid things might get awkward, we become ignorant people. We begin to lose outside perspective, or the voices we hear are only the ones that agree with us. But more critically, if we stop talking about the taboo topics in church, we begin to lose God's perspective. So the challenge, of course, in this series is to bring up topics that are very sensitive, that are very personal, that are very controversial, but go ahead and press forward with that because we want to hear. We have to hear what God has to say, because if we lose God's perspective, if we lose God's wisdom, we begin making decisions in our lives that not only dishonor God, they hurt us and they hurt the people that we love. Now, before we get started with today's message, if any of these taboo topics need to be anchored in part one of this series, it's this one. What we talked about in week one is absolutely critical for an understanding of what we're talking about today. So if you were here in week one, I'm going to give a 5-minute review of what we covered in that part of the series. If you weren't here, this is just a 5-minute overview. It's not a thorough evaluation. I hope you'll take time this week and go online and watch part one of the series because it's so helpful in understanding how we can approach taboo topics in any arena in life. But in week one, we brought up the reality that all of us as human beings need to form a sense of personal identity. In fact, as human beings, every single one of us has to address 3 critical questions in our lives. The first question is, who am I? And by the time we hit adolescence, we're already asking that question. We need to know who we are. Who am I? Do I matter? Does my life have value? We all need to justify our existence. And the third question, sometimes we aren't aware we're addressing this one, even when we are, who gets to decide? Who ultimately do we hand the validating authority over to in our lives? Who is the final judge over who am I and do I matter? And like it or not, the culture in which you live, and this is impossible to overstate, the culture in which you live has massive influence on how all of us answer these 3 questions. Now, it's easier to see when you look back in time at a traditional culture. In a traditional culture, people were taught by their culture, by the world around them, that you have to look outside of yourselves to discover a greater moral truth. And in most ancient cultures, the greater moral truth was honor. You mattered as a person if you could live with honor, and honor meant you were willing to sacrifice yourself and your happiness for the sake of your tribe, your family, or your kingdom. And men could be honorable by being willing to die on the battlefield. Women could be honorable by being willing to die in childbirth. You sacrifice self for the greater good. And in traditional societies, it was the society that answered the third question, who gets to decide? It was your parents who decided who you are and if you mattered. Or it was the cultural elites, it was the great warriors or the skilled craftsmen. They were the ones who gave judgment on whether or not you mattered and who you are as a person. But all of this completely went opposite in the modern Western world. Because our culture teaches us something different. Our culture teaches us that in order to figure out who you are, you have to go deep within yourself. And you have to search your feelings, and you have to search your desires, and you have to listen to them carefully so that they can tell you who you are. And furthermore, you also are the one who gets to validate yourself. You decide whether or not you matter. Now, psychologists have found dozens of problems and weaknesses with our modern identity formation process that we have in the Western world. Here's a few that we talked about in week one. The first problem with the modern identity is that it's an unstable identity. Because if it's based on looking within yourself and your desires and your impulses and your emotions, the reality is those emotions change from season to season of life. Unless you're a teenager, then they change from minute to minute of life. But hey, if you're a teenager, we're not judging you. That's just part of the season of life that you're in. Everybody goes through that. And not only do our emotions and desires change from season to season of life, they're often in conflict with one another. Okay? What do you want now that it's almost May? Maybe you want to look good in a swimming suit this summer. And you want a quart of ice cream. You desire both of those things, right? And what you want, it's in conflict. Which one do you do? Maybe you're thinking of moving to a new city to pursue your career. And you also want your kids to have and keep their friends that they have in school, but your desires are in conflict with one another. Therefore, the modern identity is an unstable one. The second problem with the modern identity is that it's so fragile. While we claim that you can go within yourself and validate yourself and come out and demand recognition from everyone else, the reality is, as human beings, we're irreducibly social creatures. We need external validation no matter how loudly we say that we don't. So we go within ourselves, we discover who we are, and then we go out and demand that the world recognize us and validates us. And if they don't, they're not just having a different opinion, but they are challenging the very foundation of your life, because the modern identity teaches us that who you truly are as a person is on the inside, and you have to be true to your inner voice. A third problem with it is that it's an illusion. You cannot form an identity by looking only within yourself. Now, here's the illustration I used in week 1. I still haven't thought of a better illustration, so I'll just use it again. If there were an Anglo-Saxon man 1,000 years ago walking the settlement of London, and he looks within his heart and he sees aggression and rage, he would have said, "That's me. That's who I am. I'm a warrior. I want to kill people." But if he looked within himself and he also saw a sexual desire for another man, he would have said, "That's not me. I have to suppress that desire." But if an Anglo-Saxon man is walking the streets of London today and he looks within himself and he sees a rage within his heart and he wants to kill someone, he would say, "Whoa, that's not me. I need therapy." But if he feels any sexual desire at all, he would say, "Well, that's me. That's who I am." So you tell me, is he really looking within to discover who he is, or his culture dictating the answer? We can't escape the cultural implications and influence when it comes to answering the questions, who am I and do I matter? But where we landed in week 1 was that there is a way to break free from this. There is one profound idea that sets us free from the fragility and the instability of the modern identity. And do you know what that one idea is? It's God. Think about it. Even if you're not sure if there's a God, just go with me for a second. If there is a God, and most people believe there is, if there is a God, then instantly you lose the right to judge yourself. Because only a manufacturer has the right to say what something is, and only the purchaser has the right to determine the value. If you make something, you can say, this is what it is. And if you're buying something, you can determine, well, this is how much it's worth. And what did God do? God made you, and then he sent his son Jesus to die on a cross to redeem you. God is our maker. God is our purchaser. He is our redeemer, which means whatever you think about yourself has to take second chair to God the maker and God the redeemer and God who is the judge of all humanity. Only God has the authority to say who you are. Only God has the authority to determine whether or not you matter. And it is cosmic treason to claim that we do in the place of God. Yet, once we find our identity in God, we find something that is beautiful. We find something that is stable. We find something that is hopeful. God valued you so much, God thought you mattered so much that he sent his son Jesus to die on a cross to pay for your sins so that you could be with him forever in heaven, which means you've been given a new identity, and this is what it is. I am God's redeemed child, bought by the blood of Christ. My purpose is to love God and love my neighbor as myself. This is the only identity that isn't fragile. This is the only identity that is secure and stable no matter what is going on, no matter how much somebody disagrees with you, no matter what taboo topic comes along. This is still who you are. And this is what makes it safe to talk about challenging topics without getting so upset that we just shut our ears or just start yelling at other people like we see so much in our culture today. So with this as our foundation today, we are going to tackle the very challenging and the very sensitive topic of sexual identity. Now, when you saw that the topic today was sexual identity, you probably had one of two reactions. Reaction number one was, wow, I really admire Jason's courage. I question his intelligence, but I admire his courage. Or maybe you had a different reaction. Maybe you were wondering if today is the day when the other shoe drops. Because you've been coming to Hope for a while and you really like our church. But you're wondering if today is the day when you will become excluded from our church because of this topic of sexual identity. So I want to preface up front what I'm going to say, because I know in this room today, we are in all kinds of different places with this topic. I know we have all kinds of different views on this topic. So wherever you're coming from today, I want to preface everything by saying what I'm going to say today is not going to exclude you from hope. Wherever you are at with this topic, you belong here. We're glad you're here. We want you here. Yet at the same time, I think that what I say today is going to be challenging to every single one of us. As I was going through my sermon, I thought, I don't know how anybody can walk away being unchallenged when we look at what Jesus taught about sexual identity. So here's the favor I'm going to ask as we get started. For however long you've known me, for however long you've been coming here, however much trust I've been able to build up and accumulate with you, today I'm going to leverage all of that trust. I'm going to ask you, with however much trust I've built up, to be gracious to me and reserve judgment on what I have to say until the message is finished. Because we are not about to assume a reductionistic or a simplistic or naive understanding or approach to a topic as nuanced as sexual identity. And I'm asking you to do the same, to hear me out, to reserve judgment until we're finished today. Or better yet, what if you decided I'm going to reserve judgment until you and I can grab a coffee together and talk about it further? Because to be honest, a stage is not the best place to talk about sexual identity. A dialogue is the right place to talk about sexual identity, but we've got to start the conversation somewhere. So what if you decided, I'm going to reserve judgment on what Jason is saying until we can grab that coffee, because that's my invitation to you today. You can have coffee with me or one of our staff members and figure out what this looks like for you. Now, with all that kind of as a backdrop, let me tell you what I mean when I talk about sexual identity. When I talk about sexual identity, what I mean is using our sexuality to become one of the pillars, one of the foundational pillars of our sense of self or our sense of worth. It's using our sexuality to answer the questions, who am I and do I matter? Now, there has never been a civilization before ours, there has never been a culture before ours that elevated sexuality to the level of importance that we have in the Western world. No other civilization has ever used sexuality to form a sense of identity. In traditional cultures, sex was just sex. It was a desire, it was an impulse, it was an expression of love, but nobody equated it with part of this is who I am as an individual. So before we get to the Bible today, I just want to culturally take a look at how we got here to this place. Because where we're at today or knowing where to go next doesn't make any sense until we understand how we got to where we are today. Now, the first time in American culture, I think, that the modern identity formation process surged to prominence in the public eye was in the 1960s with the sexual revolution. The tenets of the sexual revolution put forth that we must be free to express our inner sexual desires without feeling any accompanying shame as a result. See, before the 1960s, things like pornography, nudity, adultery, sex outside of marriage, those things were considered a taboo in our culture. It's not that they never happened, it's that they were hidden from the public eye, and whenever they happened, there was often a sense of public shame that was associated with them. The sexual revolution put forth that there should not be any shame about these things. And the legacy of the sexual revolution is that our modern American sex ethic, what we considered normal, was revolutionary back then. Now, it's gone through stages to get where it's at today. For example, when I was a kid growing up, about 20 years after the sexual revolution, in my generation, the worst, most shameful status to be in, culturally, was a virgin. If you are a virgin, oh my goodness, you may as well have the plague. There's something wrong with you if you're a virgin. But on the other hand, if someone had more than 2 or 3 sex partners, oh my goodness, she's a slut. Look at her, right? So there was this odd tension of how many is too many. You definitely don't want to be a virgin, but you don't want to go overboard either. Well, as culture is going along, according to surveys today in America, you're not too loose until you have about 10 or 11 sex partners. At least that's what the surveys tell us. But that's normal today. The other thing that's normal today was also an inevitable result of the sexual revolution. And I think back in the 60s, most people could have seen this coming if they thought about it. And that is the legalization of same-sex marriage across our country, which of course happened 3 years ago. And here's why it was the inevitable destination of the sexual revolution. If the sexual revolution normalized the ability to express your inner desire without feeling any accompanying shame, and if America is the land of equal rights, well then, regardless of what you feel inside sexually, you should have the right to be that and express that. The only surprising thing was that it took so long for gay rights to become mainstream. But there were 2 headwinds it was facing. Number one was the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. Our ignorance and fear of AIDS put a strong headwind in gay rights as we ostracized the gay community because we were afraid of AIDS. And the other thing, of course, is we had to wait for a generation of people with traditional mindsets to die off before gay rights became mainstream. So 3 years ago, finally, if you're in a same-sex relationship, you can now legally get married. The current sexual revolution, however, is the one that I don't think people in the 60s could have seen coming. Because the new sexual revolution we're seeing as a country is the gender revolution. 10 years ago, most Americans assumed that there were 2 genders, male and female, and that's the way it is. You're born one way or the other, and that's your reality. But today, our perception of gender is evolving rapidly, and gender is no longer seen as a binary status of male and female, but now gender in our society is seen as a spectrum, and everyone falls somewhere on the gender spectrum. On one end is male, on the other end is female, and you are somewhere on that spectrum. Well, how many identified genders do we have today? It depends on who you ask, but the number ranges anywhere from 63 to 112 different genders exist today. And gender is no longer a static thing, but it can be a fluid thing that from season to season of life, and even from day to day in life, your gender can change. Now, those of you who have a traditional mindset are wondering, how in the world did we arrive at having dozens of different genders? I'm pretty sure there's only 2, not dozens. Now, if that's your thinking, currently you are not alone. This week, American singer Janelle Monáe came out as being pansexual. And she made it clear she's not bisexual, she's pansexual. On Thursday, pansexual was the most searched for word on Google, according to Google Analytics, as people are trying to figure out, wait a minute, what's the difference between bisexual and pansexual? It's simple. Bisexual assumes there's only two genders. Pansexuality embraces the fact that there are dozens of different genders, and you're into all of them. Now, to help you explain, I want to show you something, a poster that was displayed this academic year at UW-Whitewater that explains how we've arrived with the gender spectrum. It's called the gender unicorn. There are 5 different factors that contribute to a person's gender. The first is what's known as gender identity. How do I think of myself? Do I think of myself as female? Do I think of myself as male? Or do I think of myself as other? The second category is gender expression. Are you into feminine things? Or are you into masculine things? Are you into hunting and sports? Are you into cooking? What are you into? Third one is your sex assigned at birth. Now, on the poster, here's what's interesting. We have a little DNA strand right down here below the unicorn's belt. Yesterday, as I was reviewing my sermon notes, I went online to the same website, the people who created the gender unicorn, and already the next iteration is out, and they took out the DNA strand. But what they call it is your sex assigned at birth. Now, 10 years ago, we called this birth gender. Now we call it the sex that is assigned to you at birth. In other words, it's not something you choose. The doctor looked at your anatomy and said, that's a boy and that's a girl, but that wasn't your choice, that was assigned to you. And are you female, male, or other? The fourth one is, who are you physically attracted to? Are you attracted to women? Are you attracted to men? Are you attracted to other? And the last one is, who are you emotionally attracted to? Are you emotionally attracted to men? Are you emotionally attracted to women? Or are you emotionally attracted to other? Now, when you look at all these different variables and you peg where you're at on all of these variables, you begin to see, well, I guess it is possible to have a spectrum, and this is how we've arrived where we're at as a culture. Now, what's fascinating to me is, while this is being displayed at universities around our country, the artwork was clearly designed to capture the eyes of children. Because this concept is also being taught in middle schools around our country, and according to the latest research, in Generation Z, children who were born in this millennium, 50% of them believe that gender is a fluid state that can change from day to day. This was the inevitable destination of the modern identity formation process. And here's why it's inevitable. If we believe what our culture tells us, that we have to be true to our inner voice, that how we feel on the inside determines our very identity, and we decide for ourselves if we matter, that inner voice, as we saw earlier, can be very unstable. And it changes all the time, which is why now in our culture, gender is viewed as something that is dynamic, it's a spectrum, it's a continuum, and it's fluid, and people can move along that spectrum. Now, at this point, some of you want to throw your hands up in the air in frustration. You want to judge culture or judge people for thinking or being this way. And here's the reason why. When you look into your heart, you don't feel a same-sex attraction. You feel attracted to someone of the opposite sex. When you look within your heart, you don't feel at all queer. And perhaps more importantly, if you don't have any close friends or family members who do feel same-sex attraction or who do feel queer, it's pretty easy to dismiss and judge and write off other people. So here's where we're going today. I'm going to widen the circle. Our goal today is not to judge a category of people. I am not about to set up a straw man on this stage today and then whack him like a piñata and beat him down. Because all of us have been influenced by our culture. All of us, to a greater or lesser degree, have been influenced to take our sexuality and equate it with our identity. If you look inside and you feel an attraction to the opposite sex, you say, hey, that's who I am. And so you use it to justify watching porn, or sleeping with someone you're not married to, or having lust in your heart. Some of us look inside our hearts and say, hey, I'm attracted to people of the same sex, or I feel queer inside, and you use that to say, that's who I am. But what if all of us took a look inside today? But then we took a look at what God says about what we see inside of us today. In fact, the verses that really set the stage and show the approach that we want to take with this very sensitive and complex topic, it has to do with one time when someone who is a sexual minority encountered Jesus, and we see how Jesus responded in John chapter 8. In John chapter 8, it says, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. A man was too. We don't know where he was. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say? So imagine that. Jesus is on the stage. He's in the middle of a sermon. Some religious people dragging a woman they caught in adultery. He said, what do we do with this woman? Moses said we should stone her. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. You know what Jesus is saying? I agree, you're right. She's guilty. She deserves judgment. Yep. Tell you what, how about the one of you that hasn't done anything deserving judgment from God? You throw the first rock and we'll all join in after you. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then, neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. Neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin. I don't condemn you. Grace. Sweetheart, you are sinning. You need to stop. Truth. For all of us when it comes to our sexuality today, because all of us are shaped by culture, here's what our goals are. Number one, drop the rock. This is not to judge other people that have different temptations and struggles than you do. This is for you. For all of us as individuals today, that's what this is about. So drop the rock. Number two, bring the taboo topic of sexuality under the grace and truth of Jesus. What if all of us decided in this whole conversation, this whole debate, this whole topic, and my own heart and my own life, what if we bring all of this under the grace of Jesus, who says, I don't condemn you, and the truth of Jesus, who says, go and leave your life of sin? That's what we want to do today. So with that in mind, what we're going to do is we're going to see something very important in our first fill in the blank. God cares deeply about your sexuality. He cares about your sexuality. He's the creator, He made you, and He made you as a sexual creature. We find this already in the beginning in Genesis chapter 1. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and over all the wild animals and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God He created them. Male and female He created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. So, when God created the world in Genesis, He says, here's my plan. I'm making men, I'm making women, and I'm bringing them together in marriage. Because men and women reflect the image of God. And one way specifically that women and men reflect the image of God is when a man and woman come together in the marriage covenant and they mimic God's creative act and they can create human life. God's a creator, and when a man and woman come together in intimacy, in marriage, we too create life because we were made in the image of God. And very simply put forth, that is God's design and purpose for sexuality. That a husband and wife would come together in intimacy with one another. Now, Jesus affirmed this in his ministry. In Matthew chapter 19, Jesus said, "Haven't you read," he's talking about what we just read in Genesis, "haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female?" In other words, according to Jesus, gender is binary. There is no spectrum according to Jesus. God's design was there are male and there are females. Now today, people will come along and say, hold on, this shows his ignorance of what we've learned today with modern medicine. What about intersex people? Because about 1 in 2,000 people, perhaps, are born with what are known as intersex traits. In other words, when we look at their genitalia or their reproductive organs, they don't fit the typical mold of what they're supposed to look like, and they're labeled as intersex. This is nothing new. Look at what Jesus said a few verses later. "For there are eunuchs who were born that way." Now, in case you're wondering, if you've studied ancient Aramaic or Greek, they didn't have a word for intersex, okay? That just wasn't a word, so he just uses the word eunuchs. He says, yeah, there are some that are born that way. And there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. And there are those who choose to live like eunuchs. They're not eunuchs. All their reproductive organs work just fine. But they choose to live like eunuchs. Why? For the sake of the kingdom of heaven. In other words, Jesus said, just so you know, being single is not a medical condition. In fact, being single and celibate, that's your native state. That's your natural state. And not only is that your natural state, Jesus lived a single celibate life. The Apostle Paul lived a single celibate life. In fact, Paul wrote in the New Testament that he wished more people were like him, choosing to be single because marriage takes too much work. But if you're single, you can devote your time to worshiping God, serving God, and letting God be your most important relationship, because no matter your relationship status, God is supposed to be number one. But he also did say, but if you feel drawn and called towards intimacy, then by all means, enter a marriage covenant. That's sacred and that's holy, and that's part of God's design for you if he's calling you into that. So, whatever it is, the biblical authors say we're male and female. Being a virgin is not a bad thing, it's a godly thing. But if you desire intimacy, God gave us an outlet for that within the marriage covenant, because the marriage covenant is to reflect God's relationship with his people, a covenant, lifetime, committed relationship between a man and a woman. And intimacy is there in the marriage to renew the marriage covenant and that the two may become one in the marriage bed. God cares deeply about your sexuality. And it's a good gift from him. He never gave it to us that it would become our God, and he never gave it to us that it would be the way we define ourselves. He gave us Jesus so we would know how to define ourselves. I'm a redeemed child of God, bought by the blood of Christ, but because he loves us, he gave us sexuality as a gift to be used for his glory. So what happened? Well, along the way, our view of God's gift became twisted. And the one who twisted it was God's enemy named Satan. Satan is one of God's created angels. In fact, in the book of Ezekiel, we learn quite a bit about the origins of Satan, because initially he was created by God as an angel in holiness and in splendor. So in Ezekiel 28, the scripture says, "You were anointed." This is God talking to Satan. "You were anointed as a guardian cherub, for so I ordained you. You were on the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till wickedness was found in you. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor." Now, you can read more in Ezekiel 28. It goes on. But here's what happened. Satan was an exceptionally powerful, beautiful, remarkable angel who was made to serve God, worship God, and love God. Yet in his beauty, he became proud. He became corrupted. And he no longer wanted to worship God, serve God, love God, obey God. Instead, he wanted to be God. He wanted to be worshiped. He wanted to be served. The boundaries God had put for him, he did not want to obey. He wanted God's chair. He wanted God's throne. He wanted God's place. Here's what this means, and this is leading somewhere critically important. The first rebellion, what Satan did, the first rebellion happened when Satan wanted an identity that wasn't meant for him. God said, "You are an angel. You are a guardian cherub. I have made you into exceptional beauty and wonder." But Satan said, "I'm not going to respect that boundary. I want God's identity." So God cast him out of heaven. He came to earth. He saw God's creation. He saw Adam and Eve, and he went after them with the exact same lie he told himself. The exact same lie. Why respect God's boundaries and God's authority? You should sit in God's chair. Here's how it went down in Genesis chapter 3. He said to the woman, "Did God really say, 'You must not eat from any tree in the garden'?" Here's what happened. God made the world, and as we saw in Genesis 1, he said, "All right, mankind, it's yours. You're going to rule over it. You will have dominion over it. I am literally giving you the entire world. You have to find your own string, but here's the whole world. It's for you. All of it, except one thing on this entire globe belongs to me," God said. "There is one tree, and the fruit of that one tree is mine. Everything else is yours. The fruit of one tree is mine." Now, that sounds pretty reasonable, I think. I mean, the whole world except for the fruit of one tree. Why would God do that? Because in a world where you live with God and walk with God and live with holiness, God still put in a boundary so that his creation could trust him. All right, I trust you. This is bad. So that they could worship him, they could obey him, they could serve him. And that brought joy to God and joy to them. But Satan comes in and says, "Did God really say you can't eat that fruit?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the middle of the garden, but God did say, 'You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.'" "You will not certainly die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Satan's temptation was not, let's go find the worst thing you can do and do it just to stick it to God. Satan's lie was, when you look at this from this angle, isn't that beautiful? Isn't that lovely? Isn't that desirable? Look how good that is. I mean, would God really withhold this beautiful thing from you? Would God really, if God loves you, would he really ask you to curb your inner desire? No, God, don't respect his boundaries. Don't trust his wisdom. Follow your desires, trust your judgment, and take what looks pleasing in your eyes. And we see that the second rebellion, therefore, was just like the first one. Mankind fell into sin when we wanted an identity that wasn't meant for us. We wanted to be like God. We wanted to sit in his chair. We wanted to make up the rules. We wanted to disobey his authority. So we fell into sin by refusing to trust God, worship God, obey God, and say, "Hey, I know God set up boundaries, but I'm going to do what looks pleasing and good to me. I'm going to choose what is desirable to me." And when mankind did that, our very identities changed. We went from people who were holy, living in the presence of God, to people who were sinners, cast out from the presence of God, because sin is so corruptive. Holiness cannot stand in the presence of sin. It just can't. They're antithetical to one another. And sin corrupts, sin perverts, sin is unholy. And every time we sin, every time we say, "I don't care where God has put the boundaries, clearly this is lovely, clearly this is beautiful, I have a desire for this," we are saying, "I want to be like God, I want God's identity, I want to sit in God's chair." And we are committing the same sin, believing the same lie of Satan. Sin isn't that we break God's rules. Sin is that we break God's heart. See, your Heavenly Father created you to live in relationship with you. And sin breaks His heart. It breaks His heart so much that He loves you so much that He did something about that. When our identities changed and we became sinners as people who follow the desires of our own hearts, Jesus did something about that. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 5. God made Him who had no sin to be sin for us. This is Jesus. Jesus is the Son of God. He came from the Father, full of grace and full of truth, and He lived on this planet for 33 years. He was tempted in every way just as we are, the Scriptures say. Yet He was without sin, even though He was tempted. Being tempted isn't a sin. Jesus was tempted in every way, yet He lived a life that was holy and blameless. He had the identity of a saint. He had the identity of someone who is righteous and holy. But what did He do? He became sin for us. On the cross, Jesus took the burden of your sin. On the cross, Jesus took your identity as a sinner. Identity theft is such a problem nowadays. Imagine if you have $100,000 of debt, someone steals your identity, but they pay off your debt. Like, hey, here's my Social Security, here's my address, you can take my identity. That's what Jesus did. He took your identity, but not to gain something from you, but because we were indebted to God with a debt we could never repay. He became sin for us so that in Him, in other words, when our trust is in Him, when our hope is in Him, when our identity is in Him, we might become the righteousness of God. In other words, His identity as the perfect Son of God, that identity is given to you. It's imputed to you. It is a gift of righteousness given to you. When you trust in Jesus, you get a new identity. Not the identity of someone who sins, but the identity of someone who has been redeemed. And that's our next fill in the blank. Jesus redeemed us by taking our identity of sin. We have been given His identity of righteousness. Are you connecting the dots here, church? The first rebellion was when Satan wanted an identity that wasn't meant for him. Mankind fell into sin when we wanted an identity that wasn't meant for us. Jesus comes along and Jesus redeemed us by taking on our identity of sin and giving you His identity of righteousness. So that we are not defined by our impulses, we are not defined by our sexuality, and we are not defined by our temptations. We are defined by the life that Jesus Christ lived on your behalf. So if that's true, here's the question. Am I willing to bring every expression of my sexuality under the grace and truth of Jesus? Jesus said there is male and female. Jesus said sex is for married people. Jesus said certain things because sex is powerful, because it's sacred, because it's dangerous. I have established boundaries for it. Are we going to say, but this is pleasing to the eye? This is desirable. This is good. I want an identity that doesn't belong to me. Or are we going to be people who say, I'm going to bring every expression of my sexuality under the grace and truth of Jesus? Now you say, Jason, what does that mean and what does it look like? I'm not about to begin to go there from a stage, because every single one of us is in a different situation. This is where the coffee comes in, all right? But I do have some guidelines that are going to help you depending on where you're at today, and this is your homework because of that. If you are a person who, listening to what Jesus taught about a sex ethic, and if you are saying to yourself, yeah, I don't know about that. That seems so restrictive. That seems so narrow. That seems so bigoted. That seems so old school. If you're reacting to that and your honest reaction is, I just don't know. Okay, that's where you're at today. Here's your homework. Get to know Jesus better. Because think about it. If Jesus was just some guy who taught nice things, then hey, you're free to not like or disagree with or leave behind some of what he taught. But if Jesus actually is the Son of God, and if he actually died on a cross for the sin of the world and physically rose from death on the third day and ascended into heaven and will come back to judge all of mankind, then what he taught doesn't matter. He's the Son of God, just go with it because that's who he is. So it's not a matter of whether or not do you like what Jesus taught. The question is, who is Jesus? Because if he is who he said he was, then we just go with what he said. But if he wasn't who he said he was, then hey, take it or leave it. So if you're not sure, that's okay. That's where you're at today. Get to know Jesus better. In fact, we have an environment at this church. It's called First Group, and it's designed for no matter where you're at, to help you figure out your next steps in getting to know Jesus. We have one starting next week. Stop by guest services after church. We'll tell you all about it. We'll get you signed up. It's an incredible environment for people who are new to hope, and that's your homework. Get to know Jesus better. For those of you who have someone in your life and they are struggling with any sort of sexual identity, or they are defiant in their sexual identity, whether it's homosexual, heterosexual, queer, whatever, here's your homework. Love people better than anyone else does. You need to outlove the people in your life better than anyone else on the planet loves them. And here's why this is true. In our culture, when people are public with any expression of sexuality that contradicts what Jesus taught, there are basically one of two reactions. They're either condemned or they are celebrated and turned into celebrities. They're condemned, how shameful, you shouldn't be that way, or they're turned into celebrities. Hey, you have so much courage for being true to your inner self. But you know what nobody's doing out there? Nobody's redeeming them. Nobody's redeeming those stories. Nobody's redeeming sin. Nobody's redeeming struggles. Now, the church is supposed to be the place where that happens, but I think the church is just doing what all of culture does. And in churches, they seem to be going in one of two directions. Either they're saying, oh, that's a sex ethic that is outside of the biblical guidelines. We're judging you. You're horrible. You're terrible. Get out of here. And their people are being condemned. Or churches are saying, well, hey, God loves everybody, and let's just forgive, and we all have sin too, and we don't want to cast a stone, so let's just ignore what's happened. Either people are letting go of grace, and they're all truth and hammering people, or they're all grace and no truth, and they're not even caring about sin or following Jesus or being holy or the judgment that is to come. But what churches are redeeming people? God doesn't call us to let go of truth or grace. God calls us to walk into life with people and say, I don't know, this is hard. Let's follow Jesus and figure this out together. And we're going to hold on to grace and we're going to hold on to truth, and we're not going to let go of either one. But until you love them better than anyone else does, they're not going to feel redeemed. They're going to feel condemned. Love them more than the people who are condemning them. Love them more than the people who are celebrating them so that Jesus can redeem them. Did you know that approximately 1 million American adults identify as being somewhere on that spectrum as transsexual? And the suicide attempt rate in this population is 9 times the national average. Because many times they feel lonely, they feel afraid, they feel cast out. These are people made by God, loved by Him. Jesus died on a cross to forgive them. Outlove anybody else to love them. Now, for those of you who have been listening with your arms crossed and saying, Jason, I flat out disagree with everything you've said today. You're allowed to disagree. Everybody doesn't agree with me. But if that's you, here's your homework. Lean in, not out. Here's what I mean by that. If you say, Jason, I disagree with you, just so you know, I'm not cutting off the conversation. I'm not going to cut off the dialogue. And if you let me, I will lean into friendship with you. I want to hear your story. I want to have a dialogue with you. I care about you. I love you. I want to serve you. And this church cares about you, and we want to love you, and we want to serve you, and we want to hear your story. We want to get to know you. We're going to lean in. We are not going to lean out. Here's my question. If I choose to stand within the circle of what Jesus said about a sex ethic, are you going to lean out? Or will you also lean into friendship? Will you love me? Will you serve me? Will you hear my story? Will you be my friend? See, the church is the place where we can together go to Jesus and say, what does it look like to follow him? Not to be the place where people yell at each other and scream at each other and stop listening to one another because of a disagreement. Wherever you are at with this today, we're going to lean in. We're not going to lean out. I'm asking you to do the same. Will you lean in? Get to know us and get to know Jesus a little bit better? So that's your homework. Wherever you're at, get to know Jesus better. Love people better than anyone else does. And lean in. Don't lean out. Because you were made by God. Jesus redeemed you on the cross, and he wants to give you an identity that is stable and is eternal. As his child. Let me pray for you. Father in heaven, I pray for the people in this room. Your words are challenging, Jesus. Your teachings are hard sometimes. Sometimes the world we live in is challenging, and the world we live in is hard. I thank you for the people who had the courage to be here today, to listen through to the end. And I ask that all of us will have humble hearts. We don't want to be like the rest of our culture around us that is filled with pride and just shuts people out as soon as we disagree. Can we be a place of humility? In the scripture you say that you oppose the proud, but you give grace to the humble. Father, I ask that we will be a people who bring our own lives into your presence. That we submit all of our lives to your grace and truth, Jesus. Your grace because we need you to wash away all of our sins. Your truth because we need your wisdom and guidance. And we need to know what you call evil is evil and what you call good is good. Let us be that kind of people. Father, for the person listening, they feel a temptation in their hearts that is contrary to what you have taught. I ask that they will know that you are a redeemer. You redeem everything that's broken. You redeem us in our struggles. I ask that they will run to you and know your liberating love that sets us free. Give us a heart for our friends and family members who've chosen a sexual identity rather than a Christ-based identity. Help us love them and serve them so that they can be redeemed. Father, may we be a church that is always holding on to grace and truth. We never want to let our grip on either one slip. We ask this so that we can serve so many people and that you can be glorified in our community. We ask it in Jesus' name.